1 Corinthians chapter 8. In the outline, chapter 8, chapter 9, and chapter 10, for the most part, fall into a simple category of freedoms, certain freedoms in Christ. And chapter 8 is definitely that. Chapter 9 kind of stays on the subject, but it's, I would say it's more an illustration by Paul. It's one of Paul's tangents that he takes, chapter 9. Then a little bit about Israel's relationship with God and the freedoms that they have in becoming Christians. So we're in a section talking about Christian liberty. And chapter 8, as we know, is dealing with primarily the subject of human sacrifice to idols and whether we can or cannot do that. We stopped at verse 3, basically. And I wanted us to spend some time on this concept of God knowing us. I think we can know something about God. We can begin to get a sense of what God is like, because He's revealed that in the Word, right? But the real question is, can we know God as well as He can know us? Can we know God as well as He knows us? I don't think so either. Now, God knows something about us that is far more in depth than we ever going to get to know about Him. If His Spirit is living inside of us, if His Spirit is translating what is going on in our lives and communicating to God that way, through the Spirit, if the Spirit is in touch with us, then God knows more about us than we know about Him. Even though He has revealed much about what He thinks and feels about many things. So we have a good insight into what God is like. Now the other thing that's also true is we've never seen God. So as far as one of our senses, we're not going to know. We're not going to know what God looks like. And maybe that's purely a physical thing, and that's why God has always revealed Himself in a physical way, in some sort of form. Maybe as fire in the burning bush, maybe as a messenger, an angel of some kind, and maybe that's why God does it, is because we can't see Him. To some degree, you remember Moses asked to see God, and God just shows you His behind as he passes. He can't see the front of God while God is protecting him.
And so Moses really doesn't get a full view of God. He gets a glimpse of God. So our knowledge of God is very, very, very limited. Perhaps it is because as physical beings we can't really grasp what God is. We are weak and frail, and we can't really grasp what He is. This passage is repeated, the idea at least, is repeated in Galatians 4 and 9, where it says that we have this desire to know God, we want to know God, but unfortunately the relationship is the other way. Does that make us feel better? Does that make you feel better to know that God knows you better than you know Him? Okay, very good. I think that to me is comforting, to know that God knows me and God wants to know more about me, and He's in touch with who I am, so He's able to help me. There's nothing I really can do for God, right? He doesn't really need me. I think it... I think so. I think it leaves the desire to know more. We get a glimpse of God. I think it's good to have that anticipation. Waiting to see what God is like is. I'm sure we all have a lot of questions we want to ask God, and He'll fill us in. And maybe when we get there, we won't care about the questions, but at least we think about it. Yeah. But I think that also tells us something else, doesn't it? As Tom said, it's kind of scary that God knows more about us than we know about ourselves, but what does that tell us? What's that? Okay, we can't hide. That's true. Can't hide from God. Okay. Okay, I think that's really interesting. The idea that God, if we listen to Him, if we realize what our relationship is to God, that we're listening to Him, and then we're able to get that guidance. I think that's where man makes his biggest flaw, his biggest error, is that he somehow thinks him and God are on the same level. Yeah. Yeah, we think that we can somehow really do that. Think of how much control we really have in life. How much control? How much can you make the world do what you want? How much of that do you have? You know what's so sad is we try to do that with other people, but we have almost no control of ourselves, and yet we try to control other people. I always think that's humorous. And then when we do that, we try to control God as well. I think we should first start when we control ourselves. If we can get that down, then maybe we can start controlling other people. And if we can get that down, then we can control God. Not going to happen. I think God knowing more about us is a really good situation, because God knows what's best for us, and then we know who we can depend on and trust. Because even the scriptures say we can't trust our own understanding. We can't lean on our own understanding. And we can trust God. Okay, so verse 4, he says, "So then, about eating food sacrificed to idol, we know that the idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one." Remember last week started touching on the concept of, do we believe God as He is, that there's only one God and that He is all-powerful? And do we live that way? For the most part, no, because if we did, our lives would be very different. But we spend the rest of our lives trying to come to terms with the fact that there is only one God and He is in control, and we have to live accordingly. And until we believe that, we don't really have a great faith. We have a weak faith. And so, saying that there is one God is one thing, but living like there is the one God is a very different thing. In verse 5 and 6 he says, "For even if there are so-called gods," so he puts it in small g, "whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live." I think this is one of our struggles in life, is where our allegiance is. Is our allegiance to a king, a president, some man, or is it to God? Excuse me. How many times have we maybe switched the roles around and made an earthly leader supersede God. How many times do we make those who are over us, in human terms, supersede God's law? Okay, that's a good example. We could do something at work to finish a project, to be in good standing with our boss, and we will miss the Lord's Day and be in bad standing with God. I wonder how successful we're going to be. That's a failure. That's a failure right there. I think it's tough, though, because we usually say, well, I need to eat. That's our excuse. I need to eat. Yeah, I know I could lose a few pounds. But what happens to us when we do reverse that and we make God ahead of our earthly leaders? Does that cause us any trouble? Okay. So in one way you think you're getting ahead by following your earthly leaders and putting God second, when actually you're not. And then the reverse is also true. If you put God first, temporarily it seems like you're losing, you're struggling, but yet you've pleased God. Can anyone give me an example of that? Okay, a biblical example. Okay, very good. Let's put Daniel in 2017. What can I do today to put God ahead of my earthly leaders? Okay, so we go. Okay. Okay, is that easy to do, to make worship a priority, putting Sunday as the day in the week? For some it can be. If you're a firefighter or a police officer, or perhaps if you work at a hospital, sometimes you can't do that. But maybe if you talk about it and let people know where you should be, maybe at least it'll get other people to think about that. I think that's a tough thing, to put God first. Think about in the United States today, we have so many things that are good concepts in human terms, and yet they're very poor concepts in spiritual terms. How about the First Amendment? The freedom of speech. As a Christian, do you have freedom of speech? No, you don't. I know you think you do. You don't have a choice. You have to speak what is good, what is true, what is right, what is uplifting. That's what you have to preach. That's what you have to teach. That's what you have to do. You don't have a choice. Now you can do the other, but you're not doing it for God. You're not doing things the right way. So as a Christian, you really don't have a choice. You don't have freedom of speech. And even this chapter as a whole is on that subject, isn't it? We could do something that's a freedom, but yet it hurts somebody else. So now we can't do it. We don't have that freedom anymore. We can't use our freedom to hurt somebody else. How about the Second Amendment? Uh-oh. I like the way they put the First Amendment in the First Amendment spot, not the Second Amendment in the First Amendment spot. I like that.
Carlene, I saw a bumper sticker 2 days ago, indefinite. It says, "You don't like guns? Then don't buy them."
There's your freedom of choice. Yeah, I think life is a little more complicated than we'd like to make it. And I think sometimes we may make a mistake, we may make an error, and without realizing what we've done, we've perhaps put God second, and we put man first. And other times we realize, hey, I made a good choice. Maybe later you figure out, hey, I actually put God first, made a wiser decision. But it's not always going to make you popular. Think of all the things that Christians do not like about what the government is doing. And the reason why they don't is because they're following God's law, and therefore God says this is good or this is bad, and the government says the opposite. And so we have a conflict. I remember it wasn't long after 9/11, I was in a discussion with a bunch of men just from the community, and the discussion came up about fundamental groups, okay, these extremist groups, these hardline groups, and they started discussing, because they were talking about Islamic type religious groups. But as they were going through the discussion and sort of critically analyzing what a description would be of a group like that, I remember I got more and more quiet, because you know what it started doing? It started describing the church. Okay, because we are an extremist group. We believe there's one God. Most people in the world do not believe that. We believe the one God is the God of the Bible. Most people in the world do not believe that. We believe God's going to judge us by the life that we live based on these words. Most people do not believe that. So we begin painting ourselves into a corner. Woo! And there we stand all by ourselves. A bunch of extremists. That's what we are. Hopefully that's what we become, yet I think maybe in human terms we're more than that. Because our views are not our views, are they? They're God's views. And they're intended to help, not to hurt. I think that's the difference in a human extremist and someone who's trying to be more spiritual. Notice in this section it also speaks about God, the Father, and His relationship to life itself, and Jesus and His relationship to life itself. Look at verse 6. It says, there is one God, the Father, from whom all things came, and from whom we live. From whom all things came, and from whom we live. So He's the origin of all things. But then look at what it says about Jesus. In the next section, it says, through whom all things came, and through whom we live. It's interesting. Perhaps that's the concept of God coming up with the idea, the Father coming up with the idea, and then instructing the Son to continue the work. If you have your Bibles, turn to John 1. John 1, we're going to look at verse 1 through 3. And this section specifically speaks about Jesus and His role. I think it's very interesting because it gives us a better insight into world history, human history, where we came from, all these things, and it sort of sets the record straight for what Christianity is. Notice John 1 through 3. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and this that word Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So John is tying in all Scripture. That's what the Word is. All Scripture, all reason, all right thinking was with God, was God. In verse 2 he said, He was with God in the beginning. And then he says, through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. It's impossible to separate Jesus from creation. As a religion, in human terms, Christianity is not that big. And yet, Christianity is based on the work that Jesus did. Yet, if you look at what this is saying, John is saying Jesus' work is far more than that. Everything that was created by Him. That was His creation. We think of God as God creating it, which is true, because the Son is God. But yet, in the role of creation itself, Jesus was the one that actually did the work. Jesus is the one that put it together. I'm sure this is something as a Jew that is very enlightening to understand what God means, the parts that make up what we understand to be God. Even the concept itself is mind-blowing, that God is one. We don't understand that. I think we struggle with that. God is the greatest example of cooperation. He's the greatest example of family. He's the greatest example of community. He's the greatest example of unity. He's the greatest example of goodness. All those things we strive for. The sad thing about the human condition is that we aren't any of those things in our own person. Don't we wrestle with ourselves? Have we settled in our minds every issue? Or are we still debating them? I know I am. I'm still debating them. I haven't settled every issue in my mind, where my stand is. I spent all my life trying to figure that out. And yet we have an example of God having all those things done. And we can't understand that. We can't wrap our minds around that kind of consistency. 7, he says, but not everyone knows this. Not everyone knows this. What is he saying? Who's he talking about? Say it louder. Okay, but who is the everyone he's talking about? Everyone in the world? Okay. Could apply to everyone in the world. But if you look at the context is saying it's those who are debating this idea of food sacrificed to idols, eating or not eating. Or who's concerned about that? It's not the people who are sacrificing them to idols, they don't care. It's the people who are concerned about them being sacrificed to idols or not. And those are the Christians. The ones coming out of idolatry, coming into a relationship with Jesus, and they're going, can I eat this or not? They haven't figured it out yet. That's why he's saying, not everyone knows this. That's why I said earlier, do we really believe that there is one God? And I said we don't really fully understand that. We don't really fully live that. And that's what he's saying right here. He said, not everyone knows this. What? They came into Christianity and didn't know there was one God? That was probably the first lesson they got. There's only one God. He created all this. And this is what he wants. This is how he wants you to live. This is what he wants you to do. Probably the first lesson they got. And yet here he says, not everyone knows this. I don't think here he's just talking intellectually knowing. It's actually knowing in the sense that just like God knows us as opposed to the way we know Him. You fully understand it or you just kind of get an idea. We kind of have an idea about God. In contrast to that, God knows everything about us. So in terms of situations where we have to make a judgment call, should I do this or shouldn't I do this? I know I'm, as far as right and wrong, I can probably do this thing, whatever it is. But then you look around and go, well, I wonder if this is going to offend anybody. Okay, that's because you understand. Some people don't understand that. We talked a little bit about this last time. I'm sure all of us in here have things that we wouldn't do, wouldn't say, places we wouldn't go. And we believe that if you did do any of those, you would be doing something wrong. And yet there are others of us in this room that would believe completely the opposite. Okay, I had a friend that believed that you couldn't listen to religious type music with musical instruments in them. So he started throwing out all of his music. So I said, do you realize that if you do that, and Willie Nelson sings a song and mentions God in the song, out with that song. Can't do that. Anyone believe that? You don't have to raise your hand. Don't worry. We don't want to judge you. But I believe that we may still have feelings and thoughts about things like that, and we haven't moved beyond them yet, because we're not fully aware of what is right and wrong. And sometimes that comes down to the fact that we think that if we sin somehow, we're lost. We're out of grace. Some people believe that. There was a line, this is the good side. If you're doing good things, then you're saved. As soon as you make an error, you're on this side now. Now you're lost. Then you're saved. Then you're lost. We can start dancing together. Oh, we can't dance in the church. But there's no music, so I'm okay. Okay. But that's not how grace works, right? You can't just sin once and all of a sudden you're lost. That's what this subject is about. You can be doing the right thing and still be sinning. I can be doing the right thing and still be sinning. Yes. You could be doing the wrong thing and be right. Wait a minute, that's confusing now. Now I'm really confused. Well, I think it comes down to what he's saying here, what we know, our perspective. One of our concerns is, however, that if we go this route, if we keep going down this road, the squeaky wheel's always going to get the oil, and the squeaky wheel's never going to get right. Aren't we afraid of that? If I keep saying, I am the weak brother, you're causing me to stumble, you're getting in my way, I'm having all this trouble, you need to stop doing that, and the rest of my life I do that. That's not going to save you either. That's not going to save you either. I don't think he's saying here for all eternity, somebody has to keep playing the weaker brother card. I don't know. Well, your job as a Christian is to grow. Your job is to know. Your job is to mature. Your job is to move forward. You can't stay where you are. At some point, someone's going to expect you to make at least a little movement forward. You have to make a little growth. Because if you don't, that's going to count against you. You can't come into Christianity in a certain condition and remain that way for the rest of your life. It just doesn't work that way. That's not faith. Faith is dynamic. Faith is growing. Faith is moving forward. Faith is increasing your knowledge, increasing your service. Faith is maturing. So not everyone knows this. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat such food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to an idol, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. So he's trying to give us tools that we can work with. And the mature person is going to find a way to make it work, aren't they? It's the immature person that digs their heels in and says, no further. No further. It's almost like we say, don't confuse me with the facts. Don't give me any information. Don't give me any more information that I have to work with, that I have to try to grapple with, that I have to try to figure out. Don't give me that. Don't challenge me. Okay? I know we like to be like the river that takes the path of least resistance and just goes with the flow. Well, that's what the world does. Christians do the opposite thing. Our rivers flow uphill. Our rivers flow uphill. That's hard for us to accept. Well, that goes against all the laws that we know. Yeah, that's right. Spirituality goes against all human law. Notice what he says in 9. He says, "Be careful, however, that the exercise of our freedom does not become a stumbling block to the weak." So we have to be aware of that. And it's tough because a lot of times those who are spiritually mature have to be very sensitive to those who are not, because those who are not are very sensitive. Okay, if you get offended very easily, that is not a strong position. That's a weakness. I remember one time I was coaching a boys' high school team, and there were two groups in the team that I didn't know about. One group belonged to a local Mexican gang, and they were actually selling drugs in the school. Didn't know that until a little while later. I wouldn't have said what I said in the meeting if I had known that, because I probably wouldn't have felt safe walking to my car. Luckily, the parking lot where my car was parked was right next to the police station, so I felt a lot more comfortable. But we got into a discussion about the stronger and the weaker person, and so we were going back and forth because there was all this dissension on the soccer team. Well, you can't have that. You can't play a game when somebody looks across and says, "I'm not passing him the ball," when you should pass the ball to that person. So we started talking about it, and the big discussion broke out about how one was disrespecting the other one, and back and forth. And so I asked them, I said, is it a strength? Does it show strength when you're easily offended? And they sat there and thought about it. It's like, whoa. Because today it's a big deal. If you look at somebody that's strong in a weird way and they get offended, they're going to try to protect their pride, right? And they're going to take it out on you. Well, that's not a strength. That's what Paul is saying here. Being easily offended is not a strength. Being hypersensitive is not a strength. My father-in-law and I one time went to play golf, and we came up on these two guys. We were forced to play in a foursome. We didn't want to do that. We wanted to play our game, so we get forced into this foursome. So we walk up to this two guys ahead of us. Anyway, so then we didn't say anything to them because we don't know them. So we just, "Hi, how's it going?" Just kind of the general pleasantries. And as the game evolves, we start talking about other things. Start talking about what they're doing and what we're doing. But for the next few holes, pretty much every cuss word, swear word you can imagine came out of these two gentlemen's mouths. I wouldn't even say maybe perhaps gentlemen, just men. My definition of gentlemen and men are very different, I suppose. And after a while, the one guy turns to me and says, "Oh, what do you do?" Whoops. "Yeah, I go to church. I go to church every Sunday." I'm not offended by it. I used to be in the world. I used to cuss. I used to invent cuss words. I can tell you cuss words you haven't even heard before. I don't get offended by it. I think it's a weakness for us to be offended by the world. We should know what the world does, right? We shouldn't be surprised. Why are Christians surprised by what the world does? I think we're surprised because we don't know what those who are in the world are struggling with, and therefore when we're surprised, we don't know how to deal with it, right? When I talk to somebody who's in the world, I have to tell myself when the conversation starts is, don't be surprised. Because I've met people that are far more, let's say, righteous than I am. And they weren't Christians. That's scary. Ever met people like that? I've met people that are, Their lives are so well organized, they're just amazing. With no faith. They just know what is good and what is right, and they're doing it. Shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be shocked. And then the reverse is true. We shouldn't be surprised or shocked when people are living these horrendous lives, making huge errors, and we can't figure out why. How do you keep doing that? What are some of our stumbling blocks we lay down for each other? Ever thought about that? Do you lay down a few stumbling blocks for your brothers as they're following you? As they're trying to track you down? You have one?
Well, kind of goes along with that. It's just, I think the thing that I have a hard time with, people that I've offended, if they bring it to my attention, and then, we talk about it, whatever. But it's people that bring up stuff from 6 months, a year, 2 years ago that they've been harboring all the time and you never even knew. And I really have a hard time understanding how we can hold that kind of stuff in for so long. And that's a stumbling block for me.
Yeah.
Understanding get past that. Really? You're thinking of that a year ago? Why didn't you say something then?
I think it's hard maybe because maybe people don't think we're not trying to do that. And maybe when we see someone that does things deliberately, we start thinking maybe that person's really trying to make it difficult for me. Jerry?
On the stumbling block part, because I've always seen it not so much as people inside the church as non-Christians looking at the people in the church as far as how we carry ourselves outside. And one of the big things when I was younger was always you pick on the Baptists, not just for an example, because they're like, oh well, because I saw them over at the VFW, or I saw them at the grocery store getting something to drink, or I saw this or that or the other, or saw them smoking or something like that. But then it was more of a stumbling block of how we carry ourselves as Christians, or even well, I went out bird hunting with one of the guys from the church, and he was, cussing and carrying on or whatnot. And more of a stumbling block of how we present ourselves to non-Christians as far as, well, that guy's supposed to be a Christian, and look at him, he's cussing and drinking and smoking and driving fast and carrying on with other women, than it is offending people within the church.
Well, I think those are the same thing. I mean, we're all trying to go we all should be trying to go in the same direction. So whether we're hurting each other here, or whether we're hurting someone in the world from being here, to me it's the same thing. There's no difference.
You don't even know that they're looking at you.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of times people came and they're like, hey, we saw this, and I wasn't even aware that they were even paying attention to what I was doing. And then you're like, oh, maybe I shouldn't do that anymore.
Well, what should our attitude be then? I mean, you could be a stumbling block to somebody and you might not even know it. Maybe we should let people know that we're not trying to do that. And we may end up doing it, but that's not our intention. And as Tim said, at least maybe then they might come to us and say, in this area you're really making me struggle. Yeah, I think if we have that spirit, then even the world, as Jerry said, won't see us as a stumbling block. If we have some kind of issue and we're trying to deal with it and we're trying to find a way to overcome it, and we are that way with other people who have issues and trying to overcome it, then when the world looks at us, they know us as somebody completely different. They might see some of the flaws, they might see some of the errors, but we aren't going to hold on to those things. We aren't going to make this case for us protecting and keeping our weaknesses. We're going to learn to deal with them. We're going to learn to overcome them. We're going to challenge ourselves to deal with them. Whether we are the one that's not really sensitive to those around us, or whether we are the one that's overly sensitive, we're going to find a way to work it out. I think it's possible, not that it's very likely, but it's possible for someone who is weaker to intellectually understand that the stronger brother is doing something which they are permitted to do, which they have no problem doing, that you still recognize, the weaker brother still recognizes that that person is doing something that's right, even though they don't feel like they like it, even though they don't enjoy it, even though they don't want to do it. I mean, think of something so simple like, we put things on overhead. Some people don't like that. Okay, they see that as a problem in the church. That is a problem right there. Some of you may feel that way right now, but intellectually you know you can't find anything really wrong with it, but you don't like it. You could say, you know what, I don't think we should use an overhead projector because that just doesn't feel like true religion to me. That may be the way you feel. Okay, and some of that has to do with the fact that perhaps we don't like any kind of change. Any kind of change scares us. We sometimes get afraid of change because we think all change is wrong. Not all change is wrong. Even this whole chapter, Paul is trying to say that everybody needs to be adapting the way that they're living. The strong need to adapt to the weak. And the weak in time have to become stronger, and they will become the strong. And later on, they will have to adapt to the weak. Okay, if you worship here after a few years, that should not bother you. Okay? After 10, 15, 20 years of sitting in here using an overhead like that, and you still have a problem with it, someone needs to probably come to you and discipline you. Okay? Seriously, they need to come to you and say, time to get over it. You've had a lot of time to deal with it, work through it, and you should be a little bit further along now. Now, when that time is, I don't know. I think everybody grows at a different pace, and we can't make it more than it is. I think that's the difficult thing. When do we come down and say, okay, enough's enough? Your wheel's been squeaking for way too long. It's time to get moving with everybody else.